So, Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself, your career in planning in Oregon, which goes back a long ways and is quite extensive.
Okay. I graduated law school in 1977 at the University of Oregon and took some, I think it was a regional planning class there, and mostly environmental classes where I got to know, in my first year of law school, Dick Benner and Bob Stacy. And so it was Dick who suggested to me that there was a position open at 1000 Friends of Oregon in 1977. So I applied for that with literally no knowledge of housing. I had worked actually in 1986 as an intern through a University of Oregon Law School class with Janet McLennan, who was then the governor's assistant on natural resources, and had worked on helping to draft what became the Willamette River Greenway statute, which was pretty interesting. But I took the job at 1000 Friends of Oregon, and they said that I was going to be assigned to be their principal attorney on housing. And I'm fresh out of law school. So I'm going to be working for them on housing issues. And they also were going to assign me some counties where I would have principal responsibility for making sure that the cities and counties were complying with the statewide planning goals through the acknowledgement process. This is 1977. And some of those counties, well, probably the most important county was Columbia, which included the city of St. Helens, and led us at one point to my involvement in the St. Helens housing policy. So I started 1000 Friends, quickly got to know people like Burton Wiest of the Home Builders, and I'm going to assume, unless you correct me otherwise, that if you've talked with Henry Richmond,
We will be.
You will be?
Yes.
Okay. You will find out about how he established relationships with the home builders.
Me? I mean,
Yes.
Henry and I go back to those beginning days.
Okay. So, when I came in, unlike later times when a different executive director took over 1000 Friends, there were good relationships and close relationships between home builders and 1000 Friends of Oregon, and we got along very well. And
Well, Henry, and it's not to interrupt you, but Henry was clearly a houser in terms of trying to understand the whole issues of affordability and making sure that livability clearly meant the way people chose to live, and making sure that his language is in Goal 10.
Well, Henry also came from Osberg. Is everything okay then?
Yes.
Henry also came from Osberg, which had broader agendas than just land use, although land use is so broad it can cover everything. And so that might have had something to do with it. But, we had Dale DeHarport on our board back then. We had Janet Recate, who was a realtor, on our board. So we had people involved in the housing industry on the board, and I got to be friends with them. And then with Burton and Kevin Hanway when he came on, which was, I think, a year or two after I got started. And so about the time I got started, I had to learn about housing, but the advantage that I had with Goal 10 and the housing goal is that nobody else knew anything about it either. So we knew when I got started, I think the case of Seaman versus City of Durham either had been decided or was about to be decided. It might have been a year after I got started there. But that was the case that looked at probably really looked back at the Mount Laurel decision out of New Jersey, which was, I think, a 1973 decision. And probably, this is before my time, but probably had a major impact on the wording of the housing goal. You may know about that. And included the fair share and least cost concepts. And so I came in, and here was Seaman versus Durham, which looked at Goal 10 and basically said, basically applied Mount Laurel to Oregon through the language of Goal 10. And I actually wrote the language down because I think at times it's important to look back at that. And where did I put it? Okay, to provide for the housing needs of citizens of the state, buildable lands for residential use shall, not should, shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of housing units at price ranges and rent levels which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households. So there's a least cost concept. And allow for flexibility of housing type and location. There's your fair share concept. So it sure strikes me that Goal 10 was written by whoever wrote it, and I don't even know who wrote it, to incorporate those policies. And I had the advantage of Seaman versus Durham having been decided soon after I started, if not at the time, I think it was soon after. And then I got involved in cities like Lake Oswego and Wilsonville and other communities inside the Portland metro area looking at housing issues. And it wasn't limited just to the Portland metro area, but that's sort of where I started. I believe it was 1978 when Greg Winterroad came on board at DLCD. And Greg and I became very good friends, and we talk a lot, and we shared similar philosophies. And so over the course of bringing some lawsuits, some appeals, I think I may have been involved in the Happy Valley appeal as well, we got to the situation of St. Helens, and one of the big issues, which is that local governments were continuing in their land use ordinances and regulations to have standards or conditions that were discretionary and that could cost a lot. And the recognition was there that those kinds of provisions were really limiting abilities of many Oregonians to get housing at affordable costs. A couple other things happened. Metro, when did Cragg become Metro? Was that 79 or something like that?
79, I think. It's
Yeah.
I mean, it's close. It may have been 80, but I think it was 79, right?
Well, it was about that time, or in that general period, although it may have been after the St. Helens housing policy. I'm not sure of the timing of all this, that LCDC adopted the 6-8-10 rule. And are you all familiar with that rule?
Well,
but explain it anyway. Okay, what Metro did when it adopted its urban growth boundaries, it said that we're going to assume that housing will develop at lands identified for housing will develop at an average density of 6.23 units per net acre. But for purposes of Goal 10, that is not a high enough density to meet the goal. And so they looked at the communities inside the city of Portland and they said, for the largest communities, and this would include communities like Portland, Gresham, Lake Oswego. I don't know if Hillsborough was big enough yet at that time.
Beaverton was, though.
But Beaverton was, yes. We want you to zone at a minimum average density of 10 dwelling units per net acre. For more medium-sized cities, it was 8, and for smaller cities, it was 6. And they also said that the housing split in the Portland metro area needed to be 50-50 single family to multifamily.
That happened in 81 in the metro housing.
That was 81, okay. So let's go back a few years. When I first started at 1,000 Friends, Dick Raggetts was hired, and I don't know if you remember this or not, Jim.
Well,
He was hired to do a housing study. And I don't remember if it was 1,000 Friends who hired him or if it was somebody else, but we wanted to know, well, two things happened, and I may be confusing them. One, Raggetts was hired to do a housing analysis for the region, and that's probably something different than what we did. We looked at the residential zones in each jurisdiction. Yeah, because I think I wrote it. And now that I think back, and looked at what the zoning was for residential development, 2 acres, I think it was 2 acres or less, to see what the average, and it might have been 1 acre or less, and I wish I could remember, to see what the average single-family lot size was in those days. And it was something like 12,800 square feet. To give you an idea of the effectiveness of the housing rule in the Portland metro area, in 1982, it was about 8,200 square feet. So it had come down by a third. And by probably the late 80s or early 90s, it was somewhere, I think, about between 6,000 and 7,000 square feet. And today, I'm not sure what it is, it might even be smaller than that.
Oh, it is. It is.
So, so we had that information, which was really helpful to us because it gave us an idea of where things should be going. And of course, with the 6-8-10 rule, if you look at 8 as sort of the middle of it all, that's 8 divided into 4,400 is about, what, 6 units in
An acre.
an acre.
Yeah.
Or 5.5, but with the multiple family, it ended up being higher than that. So because that was just a single family that was the 8,200, it didn't include the multifamily now. So we really had my conclusion was Goal 10 was having a real impact. One of the comments I will never forget was, I forget who said it to me. He said, the housing goal will kill land use planning in Oregon because people will not accept density. And of course, there are two things, we all know there are two things that people hate, and one is density and the other is sprawl.
You've heard that.
Yes, I'm sure you have. But anyway, we looked, and me in particular, looked at the plans of all the jurisdictions probably in the Portland metro area to make sure they were complying with this rule. And outside the Portland metro area, we were looking at plans to make sure they were doing an adequate job of having densities that gave a choice for single-family homes. In other words, not all 10,000 square feet, but maybe some 5 or 6 or 8,000 square foot lots, and also having adequate multiple family lots. We took the position that a lot over 10,000 square feet wasn't really supportable under Goal 10 unless it had some sort of topographical issue or some other reason why it could be justified to be that large. But generally, we felt those lots were not affordable and were not efficient in terms of Goal 14. So there's a real link between 10 and 14. But I've gotten away from the St. Helens housing policy here.
You'll get to it.
I'll get to it. Well, what we found a lot of times is even though the zoning became adequate to provide appropriate numbers of dwelling units, the regulations were not. They might have standards like if you wanted to do a multiple family development, it had to be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. Well, that's as subjective as it can be. And other similar types of language. Public need, I think, is another one that you would see. And so we challenged those, and we won. And we won most specifically with the St. Helens. It was probably in the process of acknowledgement, so it would have been an LCDC, probably a continuance order, continuing the plan, and sending it back. And it was about that time that I think must have been decided that LCDC really needed a specific policy addressing this. And so we came up with the policy, and I have it written here. Do you want me to read it into the record? And then I'll talk a little bit about it. I will say before I read it, this was 1981 that it was adopted. And in 1983, I believe, the legislature codified the St. Helens housing policy. So the policy says, where a need has been shown for housing within an urban growth boundary at particular price ranges and rent levels, housing types determined to meet that need shall be permitted in a zone or zones with sufficient buildable land to satisfy that need. There are a lot of important terms here. I'll get to all of them. This policy shall not be construed as an infringement on a community's prerogative to, one, set approval standards under which a particular housing type is permitted outright, two, impose special conditions upon approval of a specific development proposal, or three, establish approval procedures. However, approval standards, special conditions, and the procedures applicable to both, one, must be clear and objective, and two, must not have the effect either of themselves or cumulatively, I remember putting those words in there, I think it was me, of discouraging, such as through unreasonable cost or delay, the needed housing type. So, lots of keywords here. Housing within an urban growth boundary. Goal 10 only applies inside urban growth boundaries. It doesn't apply outside. At particular price ranges and rent levels. So there's an expectation here that local governments are going to do at least some sort of analysis, more detailed for the bigger jurisdictions, maybe less so for smaller ones that can't afford it so much, but do some analysis of what people can afford at different prices and different rent levels. Okay, then it says, housing types determined to meet that need. So this is where the source of the term needed housing types came from. And initially those housing types included single-family housing, both attached and detached, manufactured housing, and multiple family housing. And then the legislature, I think a couple years later, added government-assisted housing. So all of those were needed housing types. And there are some cases that say that as long as you provide, that local governments have some choice as to what they wanted to provide. So it wasn't at first required that a local government had to provide manufactured housing if they provided multiple family housing at different densities that met the needs of people of all income levels. That was changed, I think, when the legislature said that manufactured housing is a needed housing type. So it says, housing types determined to meet that need shall be permitted. So the shall be permitted is mandatory on the local governments. They have to allow it. In a zone or zones with sufficient buildable land to meet that need. So what this said is local governments have to do buildable lands inventories. And a buildable lands inventory was not merely looking at what lands were vacant and saying we're going to build on that. They had to be serviceable, and they had to be lands that were likely to be developed for housing over the planning period. They didn't necessarily have to have services at the time, but you had to show that they could be serviced, reasonably could be serviced, over the 20-year planning period. This policy should not be construed as an infringement on local government, on a community's prerogative to set approval standards. So local governments could set the standards, but as it says later on, if they did that, they had to be clear and objective. So all discretion is taken out for housing types that were identified as needed with this caveat, to the extent that the need was shown. So in other words, if there was need shown for 500 multiple family units in a community at different price levels, and they provided opportunity for that number of units in, let's say, a couple of zones. Maybe one might be 10 units an acre and one might be 14 units an acre, something like that. To the extent they exceeded that, they could have discretionary criteria, but only to the extent that that was exceeded. Okay, so it says, the two was impose special conditions upon approval of a specific development proposal. And the easy example here is manufactured housing, because there were state laws that required that manufactured housing have certain attributes. And so they could put those in as conditions. Or they might put in some conditions for multiple family housing that would be clear and objective, but they'd have to be met. And as long as those conditions were not overly costly, they would probably have been upheld by LCDC in an acknowledgement review. And then 3 was establish approval procedures. And the procedures themselves were another way in which costs could greatly increase for housing, because local governments could delay things. Basically what LCDC said is, for the housing that's needed, we want the procedures to be prompt enough to be able to get the development application through fairly quickly. And I think this was long before the 120-day rule ever came into effect.
It was.
And of all the things in here, that's the one that I probably know the least about in terms of how effective it was. But I think the procedures went pretty quickly because the needed types had to be allowed outright. So it probably worked pretty well for those types of housing. Jim, you would know better than I would for that.
Well, when you finish, I want to ask you a question specifically
Okay.
about that.
And then we have the language, approval standards, special conditions and procedures must be clear and objective and must not have the effect either of themselves or cumulatively, because we really want to look at cumulative impacts as well. One thing in itself might not be so bad, but you put them all together and it could add a lot of cost to a proposal. Must not have the effect of discouraging through unreasonable cost or delay the needed housing type. My recollection of the St. Helens housing policy, and again, this is 81, 36 years ago, was that the people who worked on it were myself, Greg Winterode, I believe Bob Clay worked on this, Burton, and probably Don Miner. I can't think of
Clearly
it.
Don would have participated.
Hmm?
Don would have
Yes.
participated.
I think it was the 5 of us. There might have been others, but this is the group of people who I believe were most involved regularly with housing issues back in the late 70s and early 80s.
Do you have any feeling about what was going on in terms of available space, the recession that was, if you recall, interest rates were very high at that time, and that as how that affected the implementation of this, the ease of implementing it? The reason I ask is I'm underscoring the term likely to be developed over a time within the 20-year horizon when they were forecasting that.
I'm going to take this in pieces. The high interest rates, this is the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency.
79.
Yeah, it was like 15%, 16%.
21 got up to
Did
21.
it get that high? I wasn't a homeowner in those days.
That's short, that was short-term lending.
The high interest rates, I think, had a lot to do with Dick Raggett's conclusion that 50% of housing needed to be multiple family in order to be affordable. That I'm not even sure that he concluded that 50% of the public could afford a single family home, but I think he also saw that some of them would be rented. And people wanted to live in single family homes, or a lot of people did. So I think that kind of set the stage for how Goal 10 was going to be interpreted by LCDC, or not interpreted, but applied by LCDC to the Portland metro area. And there were some communities, and Happy Valley was certainly one of them. Lake Oswego was another. I think Milwaukee might have been another, and Wilsonville, that did not want to meet those standards.
And severe exclusionary zoning practices.
Right. There were other communities, and the ones that pop to mind are Portland, Gresham, and probably Hillsborough, that were not troubled by this. And so implementation, and I remember working at that time, I can't remember who, well, it was Bob Clay who was the housing person for the city. No, Bob was Bob at Portland then, or was he still?
I think he's still at the
LCD.
I thought he was at the housing division.
Oh, yes, he was at the housing division with Betty Niven.
Right.
Yes. But I think whoever was at the city of Portland was also supportive of this. And I can't recall who it was at that time. Michael Harrison was doing long-range planning. So Michael may have been involved in some of this, but, and he's a housing advocate. So, and you also had some of the people in the Northwest neighborhood who were probably still active in housing, who were active in housing in those days. So I think Portland was pretty good about it. And the city council then, I think, was probably pretty pro-housing in those days too. Yeah, you did have some communities where you had exclusionary zoning and they didn't want to change. I think Happy Valley wanted to have a minimum 15,000 square foot lot. That didn't work.
I thought it was even bigger than that, but maybe.
Yeah, well, I think it might have been 15,000. They had a 15,000 square foot lot for multiple family, but it was 8,000 if they wanted to put single family in that zone. And LCDC said no. There's a case in the Real Estate Land Use Digest on Goal 10 that talks about that. That's probably my case, but it was a long time ago. And I don't remember what the situation was with Wilsonville or some of the other communities. For some of them, it was the conditions of approval. So they put those provisions in there, but they put conditions of approval in there that basically would make sure that they wouldn't get the housing at that density, typically because neighbors would complain, which they knew would happen. Now, one of the points I want to make is that Goal 10 relies on the private sector to provide housing. You knew that. So meeting Goal 10 really is, or fully meeting Goal 10 really depends on home builders building at maximum allowable densities, or something close to maximum allowable densities. And frequently that did not happen. In fact, frequently home builders would find out that the neighbors were against their proposal, even though it was permitted outright at certain densities, and they'd reduce the overall density. So you didn't get housing built at that time. And at some point, and Jim, I don't remember when it was, I think it was in the 80s, Metro adopted a minimum density requirement so that developments occurred.
80% rule.
The 80% rule, yes, so that development would occur at least 80% of what the density was, allowed density was. Did I answer your question?
Well,
Did I leave some out?
so, one of the issues here is seeking to understand the benefits of Goal 10
Mm-hmm.
and the challenges over time as it relates to the housing produced today or the lack thereof, the unmet need. And so you raised the issue of buildable lands inventory.
Mm-hmm.
And so looking at that and calculating a buildable lands inventory using available land in terms of what hasn't yet been developed
Mm-hmm.
at an approved density. How effective was that in your mind? Did it actually produce housing? What are the limitations of the buildable lands inventory? And how successful overall is it?
Okay, so buildable lands, since I'm being taped, I'll say this, are lands that are suitable, available, and necessary. Suitable means they're physically capable of supporting the housing. Avail means they have the potential to be developed over time. And necessary means they're needed to meet the housing need. When Metro adopted its urban growth boundary, okay, I was working for 1,000 Friends of Oregon at that time, we believed the urban growth boundary contained way more land than was needed to meet housing needs over a 20-year period. So
And what year was that?
that was 79, 80 when Metro adopted its. I mean, it was 1,000 Friends' opinion, and I think I probably agreed with it, that there was plenty of land at that time to meet housing needs. Over time, the UGB got filled in, and then maybe this is where you're going, maybe it's not. And you started seeing Metro look at redeveloping lands. And that was always an interesting question. And by this time, by the 1990s, so we're no longer the origins of the housing rule, by the 1990s, I was representing Jim Sitzman on a bunch of housing issues. And we were looking at urban growth boundary expansions in that issue. And what we saw is that Metro was saying, well, we will take these lands and they will redevelop. And we were looking at some of these properties, and some of these properties had houses that were probably not old enough that anyone would want to tear them down and redevelop them. And we felt that from a political standpoint, Metro just wanted to keep the UGB really tight, and it was pushing up housing prices. And this is probably one of those areas where I started to diverge from 1,000 Friends. I had left 1,000 Friends in 1986, and I was looking at these numbers, and I was thinking, I think the reliance, at least the reliance on refill and redevelopment, was overestimated and probably underachieved. I don't know the answer. A lot of it did happen in Portland, but I question that. And
I don't want to stop you.
No, go ahead.
Why? Why do you question that? I mean, what are the things, what are the circumstances? What do you feel you've learned over time through experience why that may not have been achieved?
Okay, well, I looked at the assumptions that were made for UGB expansions. And I looked at a variety of issues, and I wish I could think about what they all were today, because they were real fresh in my mind back then, but on this factor and that factor and another factor, Metro invariably chose the strictest one. Not the middle one, not the loosest one, but the tightest, the one that would keep the tightest urban growth boundary. And I agreed with the home builders that probably was not realistic. And they
an
actually
overreaction to criticism that the UGB was too large when it was founded? I think?
could have been. Yeah, it could have been. And I don't know that we were talking about huge numbers of additional acres in those days, but we still felt that the amount of acreage that was coming in probably wasn't enough. I mean, you could put housing on it, but the housing wasn't going to be least cost, and it wasn't going to be affordable for a lot of people. I think the big factor that made housing affordable at a time when I thought it might not be affordable was interest rates dropping so substantially. I mean, I bought a house, my first house I bought at, I think 8 or 9 or, no, over 10% interest. And I refinanced it 5 years later at 7%, and refinanced it 5 years later again at, 5%, something like that. So, interest rates dropping helped make housing more affordable. But then again, Portland became so popular. This was the other issue. So many people wanted to move here because of its livability reputation that the demand got really great. And I'm not sure, other people can speak a lot better to this than I can about whether or not the supply was able to keep up with it.
So let's go back. Let's stay in the Portland market for a moment, and then I want to go outside the Portland market to other kinds of the other areas that dealt with Goal 10 issues at this same period that you looked at. So in the early 80s, late 70s, there was clearly a recession. There was East County, when I say East County, that area between Portland and Gresham,
Right.
that had generally not been developed very heavily. Inverness had not been completed, or when it got completed, it still had provided a tremendous amount of capacity that yet hadn't been able to be built on because of sanitation and sewer issues.
Nice to meet you.
So in that context, there was an abundance of, clearly an abundance of available dirt without having to do refill and redevelopment. It was just available. So there was a pushback from the home builders that no, people don't want to live in tighter lots and such like that, but they learned and they were able to do this over this period of time when there's a recession on and we had an out-migration in the state. So I know that's a commentary by me, but the question is, do you think that assisted in allowing Goal 10 at that point in time to be very effective and do some of these things as it relates to the metro housing rule, because the neighborhood impacts were not as significant as they are today?
No.
Okay.
Probably in some places that was the case. But I'm thinking of a city like Hillsborough, which was, back in 1970 when I moved here, only a few thousand people. And today it's the third or fourth largest city in the state. There was a lot of vacant land there, and a lot of development came, but people were moving into places where they didn't have neighbors. So I think in a lot of places, people were not complaining about density. Now, I could be wrong because I wasn't on the ground there, but I didn't hear a lot about that. In some places, especially near developed areas, yes, people would complain. But with the amount of vacant land, once services were extended, you were bringing new people in. And as densities got higher, that became, for many of them, that became what they were used to. So more housing at 7,000 square feet instead of 12,000 or 15,000 square feet wasn't a bother to them. And for many people, that's what they could afford. And I remember having conversations with people thinking, how wonderful it was to be living on a house of that size or a lot of that size. And even some people saying, this is too much land. I can't even maintain the property.
So when do you think this pinch point occurred where people started saying, I'm now being adversely impacted by this development?
I think, let me handle this in two parts. I think it was in the 90s when people were looking at the size of the urban growth boundary. I'm going to do a Goal 14 urbanization discussion first. And saying, okay, we've had a big urban growth boundary, but now we're starting to see where it needs to expand. Now we're starting to see where we may need to add some land to it to have adequate housing by 2015 or 2020. And I don't know if at that time people were starting to complain about the housing going in near them. The complaints that I heard, and keep in mind by this time I was not involved in housing issues and had been out of it for 10 years. My only dealing with housing, I'm going to get to one issue that I had in Canby, but my only dealing with housing in the Portland metro area was in the sense that I was representing someone, Jim Sitzman, who wanted land inside the urban growth boundary so that he could put housing on it. But that was it. So I can't really answer the question as to when that pinch was felt.
So let's move then to other areas of the state as it relates to Goal 10. Down in the valley, whether or on the east side, did Goal 10 help deal with address housing needs? Were the way the rules were being interpreted as it related to a rural community versus the metropolitan area such that it would allow it for orderly adaptation, or was there resistance? Your observation.
My recollection, I always felt that there should have been something like the 6-8-10 rule statewide, and yet LCDC never adopted it. I probably felt this way more from concerns over efficient use of land and expanding urban growth boundaries than I did from the sense that housing wasn't affordable in these other communities. Because you get outside of the Portland metro area and you get outside of maybe Salem and Eugene, back in those days, land just wasn't that expensive. I mean, I could go to a city like Scappoose probably 20 years ago and get I'm speculating here, that I could get the same house as I could get in the Portland area for half the price, just because the costs were so much lower. So LCDC didn't push density as much, at least in the smaller communities. And I think that even the statute distinguished between smaller communities and larger cities for purposes of housing. This would be 197, 303 to 307, that area of the statutes. But in communities like Eugene and Salem, I always felt that they should have had a rule like this. Now, whether or not, how good a job they were doing of meeting the housing goal, I don't know. Because I think I told you I was assigned a number of counties, which included Douglas County and Union County and Columbia County. And I think I may have, did I have Multnomah County? I'm not sure. I didn't, for housing. Well, for housing, I had the whole community, the whole metro area. I don't think I had Multnomah County, but I had a variety of counties. But in 1981, we had some visitors move to Central Oregon called the Rajneeshis. And 1,000 Friends of Oregon took a particular interest in what they were doing to land and what we thought were abuses of the land use laws. And that became my principal focus from 1981 to 1986 when I left 1,000 Friends. And I kind of got out of the housing market then. And that was a time when these issues were getting looked at downstate and in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon. So I don't feel real qualified to answer that question, which is unfortunately something I may say to a number of questions as we get beyond into the 1980s and beyond the 1980s. I just got completely taken out of housing. And then when I left 1,000 Friends, I got asked, interestingly enough, to help write the transportation planning rule. And prior to that time, I had been asked by ODOT to work on the Western Bypass study and was hired by TriMet to do the West Side Light Rail. So you can see this movement towards transportation. And I really got into, as of about 1991, I was probably doing 60-65% work in transportation, and much of the rest of the work I was doing was for port districts and industrial development, and kind of got out of housing altogether. One exception was that I got hired by some folks in Canby, and I want to talk about this. to help them develop a 30-acre piece of property. This would have been, I think, in the mid or late 1990s, to develop this piece of property for a residential subdivision at, I believe, probably 10,000 square foot lots. And that would have been fairly normal for Canby back at that time. The property was completely surrounded by urban development. It was 30 acres. They had farmed it. And it actually, I think, was, no, it must have been inside the urban growth boundary. But for some reason or other, they couldn't develop it for housing. So they went to the city. It wasn't the county, they went to the city. And they said, basically, we're surrounded on 4 sides by development. We have people complain about dust. We have people complain about agricultural practices. And when I was at 1,000 Friends of Oregon, that is precisely the argument that 1,000 Friends of Oregon made as to why more intense urban scale development should not be allowed next to farmlands. You need separation. And yet 1,000 Friends challenged that action, which was something I never understood and still to this day don't understand. I always felt, wasn't there something better to do than to fight this development? And of course, one of the things about it was because it was infill, it was opposed by the people who lived in the houses surrounding it. They wanted it as their private park. And they would walk across it and they would use it, even though it wasn't their property. And so we did have those kinds of fights. And I think as you saw lands that had been passed over getting infilled, you were dealing with those issues. In Portland, you started dealing with people fighting over redeveloping single-family neighborhoods into condominiums. That happened a lot in Northwest Portland. And so these issues did arise, and I think to that extent it probably did get harder for home builders to build housing.
So in that context, has Goal 10 helped any? Did it provide an opportunity to use as a justification for refill and or infill development?
Well, Goal 10 helps because it has the language that I mentioned that requires local governments to do housing studies and to update their housing studies and to provide adequate land. So the question really is not, to me, does Goal 10 help, but has Goal 10 been adequately enforced at the state level through periodic review? I think at the initial acknowledgement stage it was probably fine. But through periodic review, how carefully are the people at DLCD reviewing these plans to make sure that when a local government says, we've got X number of buildable acres for single family in our plan, and we've got Y number of acres for multiple family at different densities in the plan, and we're relying on this amount of redevelopment, that in fact it's likely to happen. But ultimately, Goal 10 still depends on the developers to provide the housing. It depends on the market to respond, depends on the building industry to respond to the market. And whether or not that happens, I don't know. All Goal 10 says is you have to provide that opportunity.
Is that a weakness?
I don't think it was a weakness back in the 80s. And I don't know if it's a weakness now. I don't think you want government in the housing industry. That's one of the industries where I think you rely on the private sector. I also have always been told Whether it's true or not, I don't know. I've always been told that the private sector knows what the market is, and they're willing to respond to it because they're going to make money that way. So if all that is true, then it would seem to me that Goal 10 should still be working.
So we have just in that context, and I know this is jumping ahead when you've retired from housing, but if you read the media, if you listen to a lot of politicians, we're in a housing crisis today. And this housing crisis is because we aren't responding to an adequate number of houses for people in certain income ranges. So that's an indicator, at least from the media and politicians, that something's not right with Goal 10.
Okay.
So your observation about that, I mean, this is not an issue of being critical of Goal 10. I'm trying to find why.
Okay, so we have a homeless crisis. I know we have that, and they talk about the housing for the homeless. And that's one issue in and of itself, which is probably linked to the economy and linked to, factors way beyond our control, like globalization and mechanization, using robots to do what people used to do. So we have all those issues. And I don't know that the country's come to terms with that yet, or knows how to come to terms with that yet. So that's one part of it. A second part of it is that I don't know, and you may know this better than I do, I don't know how much periodic review is still happening, or even if it's still happening. And that was a tool that LCDC had with local governments to, to make sure that adequate land supplies continue to be provided. So it's possible that the land supplies are running out and they're not being replenished because the local governments aren't going through periodic review. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I think it is. We also have situations. I mean, let me give you this example. There have been a lot of ADUs built in the Portland area now, accessory dwelling units, which has had the effect of actually significantly increasing overall density, and a lot of people like it. There was talk in the most recent legislative session, and I know because I was involved in these talks, about putting ADUs on rural lands, and including places like Selfie Island, where I live, for the purported argument of providing affordable housing for people in the region who need it. And yet, I knew, and a lot of other people knew, that these rural lands are not near services, are not near transportation. If you wanted to go shopping, are not near jobs. So if you wanted to go shopping or get gas or go to your job, you'd be driving 10, 15 miles or further in each direction. And that really, the reason why people in areas like Selfie Island wanted them was to rent them on Airbnb. And the people, I mean, to their credit, the people on Selfie Island were straightforward about it. We're not here to give affordable housing. We're here to make an extra $100, $200, $300, $400 a night renting out 1 or 2 units to somebody who lives somewhere outside of Oregon or outside the United States. So ADUs, I think ADUs are a really good idea, but they have to be inside urban growth boundaries. And they can help provide affordable housing.
So, Mark, we have this high housing cost in the metropolitan area, and we have a Goal 10 that basically says you're supposed to make sure that you have available land at all these different price levels and income levels and types. And it doesn't appear that it's happening. Do you have any observations about what may be constraining the market from actually allowing that to happen?
I want to answer this in a couple of ways. And I'm going to talk more about my understanding of Goal 10, because I'm not sure Goal 10 is the culprit. Goal 10 requires local governments to make opportunities available for housing. It doesn't force them to purchase land, and it doesn't force a landowner to sell land. And there may be reasons beyond what I know as to why property owners hold on to land. But Goal 14, the urbanization goal, requires Metro, when it identifies land for urban development, to consider the likelihood of that land actually being available for development over a 20-year period. Buildable land is land identified not just as suitable and necessary, but available. And available means a likelihood of being available over the planning period. So it may well be that Metro is not adequately looking at all of the different market forces that are preventing the lands from becoming available right now and making more land available to compensate for that. Does that make sense to you?
Or maybe incenting. I mean,
Incenting people to sell.
Yeah, incenting, using incentive policies, not necessarily buying the land itself, but.
So you have tax policies or other policies that may make it not worth a person's while to sell their land for development. They may hold it for any number of reasons. And I suppose you could have local governments or Metro or someone or the state creating incentives for sale. But if those aren't there, then again, it strikes me this is more a Goal 14 issue than a Goal 10 issue. There may be technically enough land available to meet the need, or enough land planned and zoned, to meet a 20-year need for housing. But if in fact all indications are that it's not developing for reasons that we are able to figure out, then it seems to me that under Goal 10, you can make a good argument that there's not enough land in the urban growth boundary. And Goal 14 is violated because Goal 14 is required to provide enough land to meet housing and employment needs.
So in the context of today, and using your example in Canby, and not particularly pointing to Thousand Friends or any other organization, it's the issue of what are the things that are associated with the rule and or the system that actually impede the identified utilization of the land by a local government, that 30 acres as you explained. What's not working? Do you see, what are the pieces that need to be
Well, we need to
corrected?
talk about Canby, because Canby, the applicant got local government approval. They got exactly the kind of approval that Goal 10 intends to allow the development of that use. What you can't stop is somebody appealing that decision to LUBA. And if there is an appeal is going to add delay, an appeal is going to add cost. But ultimately, this Canby development was approved, and it was built at the densities that were proposed. And they did not reduce densities simply because people who lived in surrounding properties, or some of those people, complained. They didn't do it.
So the system does work.
In that instance, the system worked. I don't know how, given that Goal 10 requires clear and objective conditions or approval standards, excuse me. And up until about, I'm going to say about 3 years ago when I retired from the practice of law, I used to read every LUBA case. And there were still some appeals, typically by someone like Bill Close out of Eugene, representing home building interests down there, claiming that certain provisions were or weren't clear and objective. Except for those cases, and he often lost on those cases. Well, maybe I shouldn't say often. He sometimes lost on those cases, and he probably sometimes won. It appeared to me that the standards in local plans were still clear and objective for allowing needed housing types outright. And it also appeared to me from cases I read that whenever somebody would appeal a decision, say, to rezone land from residential to commercial or industrial, if someone brought a lawsuit saying you're taking too much land out of the buildable lands inventory, you don't have enough to meet the need for goal 10, that lawsuit always won. I mean, that was an easy win. So I would guess that in the last, say, 15 years of my law practice, that ended something like 2015 or thereabouts, I started seeing very few goal 10 cases because there wasn't a lot of reason to bring cases under goal 10. Now, housing affordability today is a big issue for a variety of issues, for a variety of reasons. I'm not sure that goal 10 is the culprit. I guess that's the point I would make. If, in fact, the zoning allows needed housing outright, and local governments maintain their inventories of buildable land, and local governments maintain a choice of housing, then the problem seems to be somewhere else. It's either that the urban growth boundary needs to be expanded, or that there are reasons above and beyond goal 10 that are suddenly making housing unaffordable, or that maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, since the last update of plans, we suddenly have reached a point where, you know, the plan was adopted and approved when 50% or 60% of people could afford a single family home, and today that number is a lot less, and the readjustment hasn't occurred yet. But then that's a problem with the absence of periodic review. It's not really a problem with goal 10, except for the fact that some local governments may need to update their plans and revisit goal 10. That would be my thought on this issue.
And so there are cost issues associated with that to local governments that don't have the capacity to update and the like. Your comment on that?
This is a big issue because there are cost issues with the state as well. The state is what, $1.5 billion short? Is that what they're saying they are right now? And they don't know where the money's coming from. And you've had, what, since at least the mid-1990s, at least one political party saying no new taxes. I mean, it's really hard to pay for these things and to pay for government work that needs to be done when the amount of money coming in on a yearly basis keeps shrinking. And you know, you have a recession, all of a sudden the economy goes down, and it takes a while to recover from that. So there are a lot of kind of other reasons that are making it very difficult for LCDC to do the job today that maybe it did 20 years ago. Because back in the 90s and even the early 2000s, plans were still being reviewed on a regular basis. They were being updated on a regular basis. And the system seemed to be working well. And I think it's mostly in the last 5 or 6 or 8 years where we've seen a change in that.
So we've had the Big Look,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of versions
Mm-hmm.
of the Big Look. There have been
Forgot about
times,
that.
times that people have suggested that this is a 40-year program that
Mhm.
has evolved, but
Mhm.
has maybe not evolved as fast as Oregon has grown
Yes.
and such. So do you have any observations about that, on how, what should be done, on what approach, and what the obstacles might be for a different look or an updated look, or allowing things to morph in an appropriate manner?
Well, I think the comment that you made earlier, Jim, is probably one of the things that could be done, which is to create incentives for people who have large blocks of land to sell them. I mean, we have urban reserves and we have rural reserves, and my sense is, and always has been, is that as the urban growth boundary gets smaller, or the amount of buildable land gets smaller, the value of that land increases, which creates an incentive in itself for people to sell it. Unfortunately, there's the other side of that coin, which is as the cost of that land get higher, the cost of the housing that's going to go on that land are going to increase because of the land costs, making housing less affordable. There's also the fact, and I don't know how you get around this either, 20 or 30 years ago, Portland was still sort of on everybody's back burner. Today it's in, I don't know how many different magazines, most livable cities to live in, and I meet people constantly who want to move here, who don't live here but want to move here. And they may or may not have an occupation that's going to get them a job, and sometimes they don't worry about that. They're just going to try to come here, and they've come here and they find that they can't find affordable housing just because the market's so tight, because there's, hundreds of other people or thousands of other people just like them doing exactly the same thing. The other comment I wanted to make is the issue of extending services. And generally, I think that, let me use Washington County as an example, because I had a client who had land that had services. Now that land, he wanted to use it for residential development. Ultimately, it became more appropriate for industrial development. And in fact, industrial development is how it should have developed. But he had services right there. And his property was left out of the urban growth boundary, and other properties without services were brought in. Now, I think it's true that these other properties can have services extended over the planning period. But I think there was also a recognition that it would be 5 or 10 years before those services would be extended. And that in itself creates a bit of a problem when there aren't a lot of other properties in the area that are buildable at the time.
So I hate to infer from your comment,
Go ahead.
but you've raised a notion. Why is that? Because sometimes, are they planning decisions that are being made, or are they political decisions that are being
Oh,
made?
well, you know the answer to that. Let's say that sometimes the planning decisions reflect the political decisions. So in the Portland metro area, this actually happened with the industrial land that I talked about. I was told if we could get 3 other votes, this person would join them to bring the land in. But there was a group called Save Helvetia. You've probably heard of them. And they wanted no development north of Highway 26 or west of Helvetia Road. And this property bordered Helvetia Road on the west side. The east side is already inside the urban growth boundary, and the urban services are right there on or in extremely close proximity to Helvetia Road. So the political decision was made to bring in lands on the south side of Hillsborough that actually were better agricultural lands than my clients, bring them in. Now, this was mostly for industrial development, but some of it was residential too. Instead, because they didn't want to have to deal with the stress, and I'm going to say the stress of the people who were involved with Save Helvetia. Now, some of those people were reasonable people, but some of them were nasty. And some of them didn't hesitate to assert their nastiness on Metro elected officials in a very stressful way. And I talked with some of these officials because I know them. Some of them are actually pretty good friends of mine. And they were telling me just how really hard it was to put up with these folks. And so I think there's a tendency, there's a human tendency to take the path of least resistance sometimes. Now, I actually admire and respect a number of the people on the Metro Council. I think they're there trying to do a good job. But it's a hard job, and it's really hard when the politics of growth, and this is overall growth, this isn't just housing, this is any type of growth, when the politics stick their head into it. Now, I'm politically involved, very politically involved, on Solvay Island. But Solvay Island is a rural reserve. Solvay Island is perhaps the best agricultural land in the region. And while many of the people who support positions I take do it from not in my backyard, I do it because I believe in preserving agricultural land for productive farm use, and I don't want to see it nickel and dime to death.
So you raise an interesting thing, and I'm going to try and I don't want to ask you a leading question, and I really mean that. So in concluding, what can the university do? Is there a university role in kind of this dialogue that we've talked about? What's great about what we have? The Goal 10 is obviously aspirationally phenomenal. Yes, there's maybe a little bit of a hiccup in the application of Goal 14 and such like this, but how do we kind of massage this to allow an orderly morphing of it? And what's the university's role?
Well, it's very interesting because I'm going to talk a little bit about 1,000 Friends of Oregon. They just hired Russ Hoflick to be their new executive director, and Russ was formerly for 25 or more years, I think, the head of the director of the Oregon chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Russ dealt effectively with people of all interests, people of all political persuasions, people of all businesses, and I go back to the Henry Richmond days when Henry made those same kinds of connections. It has been, almost 45 years since the land use goals were adopted, including Goal 10. That was 1974, so it's been 43 years. And I find, just from my own experiences living on Solvay Island, that we have a generation of people now who weren't here when all the land use arguments and debates were going on in the 70s and the 80s and maybe even into the 90s. And they don't know about it. They don't know what it's supposed to do. They don't know what it's supposed to accomplish, and maybe more importantly, they don't know why it exists. I think it is time to re-educate the public, and in doing so, re-educate ourselves based on changing circumstances. I think we need to get people like Russ, and like Henry, and like you, and home builder interests, and economic development interests, and metro people together, and talk about this, and talk about it openly, and look at issues like the fact that there's all these lands which are in the urban growth boundary, which would be terrific to develop, But we knew 15 years ago they wouldn't be developed at this point, and they're still not developing now, and they may not be developing 15 years from now. And say, what do we do about this? Because we do have the problem that if the Portland metro area doesn't develop, it is going to be satellite cities like North Plains and like Newburgh and Canby and maybe St. Helens or Sandy. And people are going to be commuting 20 or 30 miles instead of 10 or 15. And you're going to be losing good farmland out there, probably in a much more inefficient way than you are with development inside the Portland area. So those are big issues, and they need to be addressed. And I think in terms of what Portland State can do, maybe it can put a program together that brings people together, important people together, to answer those questions.
Well, that's great, and that's a good challenge to us here at the university, and I really thank you, Mark, for the time that you've taken to give to us. Hopefully we can learn from it, and we will, and we will use this, and as I shared at the beginning, we will have this corollary panel that we're going to bring together to talk about these kinds of issues and listen to each other and talk about it. And then more so in the fall when we're going to talk about, okay, what are the results of housing? Is there really a crisis? If in fact there is, how could Goal 10 or Goal 14 or better interfacing between all of these respective goals be able to address those challenges?
And I might just add, if it's not enough simply to have a conference. You have to do something after that, which means that if you have a conference, you need people on the Land Conservation Development Commission attending it. You need people from the agency attending it, and you need people from the governor's office attending it.
Thank you very much. Great wisdom. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Great.
It's good to see you, Jim.
Thank you, Mark.